The Senate chamber buzzed with a low hum as the hearing came to order, cameras clicking, aides whispering behind rows of notepads. Kash Patel adjusted his tie, his posture relaxed, almost defiant. He had sat through these before. Political theater, he called it, nothing he hadn't seen coming. But then the room shifted. The kind of shift you feel, not see. Senator John Kennedy, slow, deliberate, walked up to the microphone. No notes, no papers. Just a tired look in his eyes, like a man who'd spent the night deciding whether to break a promise. "Mr. Patel," he began, voice calm but laced with something colder, "I was hoping today would be like any other hearing. Routine. Uneventful, but if you force my hand, if you make me speak the truth, then you best brace yourself." A pause, not dramatic, not performative, just heavy, like the air knew what was coming before the people did. Patel gave a half smile, the kind politicians give when they think they've still got the upper hand. He leaned toward the mic. "With all due respect, Senator, I have nothing to hide." Kennedy didn't blink. "That's good. Then you won't mind if we walk through some of your, let's say, extracurricular decisions during your tenure as director." The aides looked up. A few senators shifted in their chairs. They hadn't been briefed on any bombshells today. Patel's appointment had been controversial, sure, but this wasn't supposed to be one of those hearings. Kennedy's southern drawl was soft but precise, the kind that wrapped around a word just before it cut it in half. The American people were told the FBI's priorities were national security, public safety, and the Constitution, he said. But under your watch, Mr. Patel, it seems those priorities took a backseat to something else. Something personal, something political. Patel narrowed his eyes. "Senator, I reject the premise of—" "I'm not finished," Kennedy cut in, still calm. "Let's talk about June 12th. You remember that date?" Patel blinked. "Of course you do," Kennedy continued. "It's the day your office approved an internal reallocation of FBI resources, away from interstate gun trafficking task forces toward a new initiative, one that targeted nonviolent political protests, peaceful assemblies, Mr. Patel, monitored, logged, in some cases disrupted." Patel cleared his throat. "Those actions were taken in accordance with public safety protocols." "Protocols," Kennedy repeated slowly. "Is that what we are calling it now? Because back where I come from, when government starts surveilling citizens without probable cause, we don't call it protocol. We call it a problem." He let that sit. The kind of sentence you don't rush past. The kind that rolls through the room like a summer storm, quiet at first, then undeniable. Kennedy leaned forward now, folding his hands. "You see, I didn't come here today looking for a fight. But I came prepared for one." Patel shifted in his seat. "Over the past 4 months, I've reviewed internal memos, whistleblower reports, and procurement requests that raise more questions than a Baptist sermon raises hands," Kennedy said. "And the answers all seem to lead back to you." The room fell into a heavier silence. Not even the press clicked. One aide scribbled furiously, another just stared. Kennedy's tone never changed, still low, still conversational. That made it worse. "This isn't about politics, Mr. Patel. It's about power, how it's used, and in your case, how it's misused." Patel opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I'll be asking you questions today that you'll want to dodge. You may try to spin, deflect, or delay, but let me give you a bit of advice, man to man." Kennedy leaned back just a touch, eyes locked. The truth doesn't wait for permission. No one spoke, and for the first time that morning, Kash Patel looked like a man who wasn't sure how the day would end. Kennedy flipped open a slender leather folder and adjusted his glasses with a deliberate calm that made Patel's jaw tighten. No accusations yet, no raised voice, just the methodical pace of a man who already knew the answer to every question he was about to ask. "Mr. Patel," Kennedy began, "in fiscal quarter 2 of last year, the Bureau authorized a transfer of $87,000 to an entity listed as Liberty Forward Initiative. Are you familiar with that name?" Patel gave a practiced shrug. "Senator, I don't personally oversee every line item in the Bureau's budget." "I wouldn't expect you to," Kennedy replied, nodding once. "But this one stands out, doesn't it? The address listed for Liberty Forward Initiative is a P.O. box in Sarasota, Florida. No website, no staff directory, no record of prior government contracts. Patel folded his arms. Our procurement division handles vendor vetting if something slipped through. Except this wasn't a procurement, Kennedy said, voice still level. This was a grant, earmarked for public trust initiatives. And wouldn't you know, that same PO box just so happens to be the mailing address for a political action committee, one founded by a former campaign advisor to President Trump, a man who also served, coincidentally, as your personal counsel during the congressional inquiry last year. A quiet thud. Someone had dropped a pen in the gallery and no one dared reach to pick it up. Patel shifted. That connection is purely coincidental. Kennedy didn't smile. That's a lot of coincidence for one box. He let the silence stretch. Now, Kennedy continued, you might say this is all above board. That every dollar was spent lawfully. And maybe it was, maybe, but then there's another payment. $62,000 this time, to an entity called Civic Faith Partnership. Heard of them? Patel hesitated. I don't recall that name. That's strange, Kennedy said, because their founding charter lists you as one of the 3 original incorporators. A beat, then another. Patel blinked once, lips pressed in a flat line. I stepped away from that organization before my appointment, Patel said carefully. Technically, yes, Kennedy replied, 3 days before your nomination, after which the Bureau began funneling money to it, again for community outreach, again with no deliverables submitted, no audit trail, no measurable impact. Patel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Kennedy flipped another page. There's a pattern emerging, Mr. Patel, not of criminality, not yet, but of convenience, of familiarity. These are not random partners. These are people with ties to you, to political operators, to super PACs. It raises a question the American people deserve an answer to. Kennedy leaned in, and the volume in his voice dropped, not louder but heavier. What was the FBI buying, Mr. Patel, and who was really cashing in? Patel's jaw tightened. Senator, if there were concerns about these transactions, they should have been flagged by the Inspector General. To my knowledge, they were not. Interesting point, Kennedy said, because the same week the Inspector General's office requested documents related to Civic Faith Partnership, their request was withdrawn. Not denied, not fulfilled, withdrawn, and the case was closed without review. Are you implying I interfered with an IG investigation? I'm not implying anything, Kennedy replied. I'm observing the timeline. Another pause. Patel sat motionless, his eyes betraying nothing, but the room could feel the shift, like the wind before a thunderclap, something unspoken but undeniable. Kennedy took a slow breath. You see, Mr. Patel, I'm not here to play prosecutor. I'm here to protect the people who put us in these chairs, and they have a right to know when public funds are being routed through shadow networks of loyalty and favors. Patel raised a brow. Shadow networks. Kennedy looked him dead in the eye. You served at the top of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. That kind of power doesn't disappear overnight. It redirects. And in this case, it seems to have redirected itself into the pockets of friends, former allies, and political actors, all under the guise of civic programs that nobody can seem to verify. The room held still, not because the allegation had landed, but because it hadn't fully unfolded yet. Everyone was waiting for what came next, but Kennedy wasn't ready to give it yet. He knew how to let suspicion grow its own legs. He closed the folder slowly, almost gently, and slid it aside. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly. Patel stared ahead, jaw clenched, fingers curled inward slightly, like a man trying not to flinch before the second strike. And somewhere beyond the chamber, in offices not yet named, someone else was already wondering if their turn would come next. Patel leaned into the microphone, his voice sharpened, no longer wrapped in courtesy. Senator Kennedy, with all due respect, these insinuations, these breadcrumbs you're scattering, are nothing more than a politically motivated fishing expedition. I served this country with integrity, and unless you have direct evidence of wrongdoing, I suggest we focus on facts, not narratives. There it was, the deflection, clean, confident textbook. The kind of line you throw to rattle the press and reframe the hearing. A few murmurs stirred behind the dais. A sympathetic senator from the minority party nodded, visibly relieved that Patel had finally fought back. But Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't respond. He just sat still, watching, letting the silence pile up like snow on a branch. Patel took that pause as permission. For years, he continued, I've been targeted by political actors who don't like my associations. My record speaks for itself. Under my direction, the FBI prevented multiple credible threats against national security, including cyber intrusions and foreign interference plots. And now, because I made decisions some don't like, I'm here defending community grants. This isn't oversight, Senator. This is theater. Kennedy's lips parted just slightly. You done? Patel straightened his back. I'd prefer we spend this hearing addressing genuine national security concerns, not political paranoia. Kennedy exhaled slowly, like someone reading the last sentence of a bad novel. Then he spoke. You mentioned national security, he said, tone even. And yet, the very budget lines we're discussing came at the expense of counterintelligence programs. You diverted funds away from active Russian infiltration monitoring teams. That was your call. That's misleading, Patel shot back. Resource reallocation was necessary due to operational shifts, and I consulted with both internal and external advisors before making any changes. Internal advisors, Kennedy echoed. Would that include Mr. Halston? He flipped a page. Your former campaign strategist. Patel hesitated. Mr. Halston was hired in a compliance consulting capacity. Not according to email records, Kennedy said, now glancing at the folder again. According to those, he was brought in to help shape the Bureau's public image ahead of midterms. Now tell me, Mr. Patel, when did shaping public image become the mandate of federal law enforcement? Patel shook his head. That phrasing is taken out of context. Kennedy looked up. I'm quoting your email. Another silence, this one heavier. The kind you feel in your teeth. Patel's jaw tightened. Those emails were internal brainstorming, not final policy. And yet, Kennedy continued, those brainstorms resulted in resource redirection, hiring of politically affiliated vendors, and funding of civic groups with no oversight. That's not brainstorming, Mr. Patel. That's budgeting. One of Patel's aides leaned over to whisper something. It was supposed to be subtle. It was. Kennedy caught it. I'm sorry, could you repeat that for the record? The aide froze. Patel raised a hand, defensive. He was reminding me of the timeline regarding the Halston contract. Kennedy tilted his head. Interesting, because that timeline just became very important. He reached down, pulled out a slim document, and held it up. According to procurement logs, Halston's firm received its first payment 2 weeks before your formal directive to review external communications frameworks. That directive, by the way, was backdated in the public record. You signed it on May 17th, but the metadata shows the file was created May 24th. Patel's mouth opened, then shut, then opened again slower. That discrepancy is likely a clerical error. Kennedy didn't smile. Clerical errors don't move money. The tension broke the air like a taut wire. Across the room, some leaned forward, others leaned back, but no one was relaxed. Let me tell you what I think happened, Kennedy said, voice lower now. I think you used Bureau funds to lay the groundwork for political influence operations. You brought in allies, you disguised them as vendors, and you funded their work through ambiguous budget lines labeled as outreach or community engagement. You buried the paper trail, but not deep enough. Patel shook his head slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching. This is absurd. Is it? Kennedy asked. Because I've got another invoice here, dated April 5th, approved by your office, sent to a firm called Argonne Strategies. The listed service, public sentiment analysis tied to voter demographics in Michigan and Pennsylvania. And here's the kicker, that invoice was processed through a Bureau fund labeled Urban Safety Perception Metrics. Now, I don't know what kind of crime data you think you're analyzing, but it sure looks like polling. That's not what it was, Patel said, suddenly more forceful. Those were risk assessment models. Sure, Kennedy replied. Risk assessments for voter turnout patterns. That's a gross mischaracterization. And yet, Kennedy leaned back slightly, you can't produce a single crime statistic, report, or neighborhood impact analysis tied to those contracts. Patel's silence stretched. His aide scribbled something furiously. Another staffer leaned in, whispering again. This time Patel waved him off. Senator, he said finally, slower now, each word carefully shaped, you are selectively interpreting administrative documents to paint a narrative that suits your political goals. That is dangerous and beneath this institution. Kennedy nodded once. It would be if I were making it up. He opened the folder once more. But we've got procurement logs, internal emails, contract invoices, timeline inconsistencies, misrepresented deliverables. And now, 2 separate staffers confirming that the outreach programs you funded were advised, and in some cases staffed, by political operatives with no law enforcement background. He closed the folder softly. Tell me again, Mr. Patel, which part am I inventing? Patel didn't answer, because at that moment, the only thing more dangerous than speaking was confirming that Kennedy had just laid the kindling around him. And all it would take now was a single match. The room had gone still, like the breath had been vacuumed out of it. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz a little softer as Kennedy reached under the table and retrieved a sealed envelope. It wasn't bulky, it didn't glow, but somehow it radiated a presence, like a loaded pistol laid gently on the tablecloth of a dinner party. He slid it across the polished wood surface, stopping it inches from the microphone. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, almost gentle. This, he said, is a copy of a confidential internal review conducted by the Bureau's own Office of Professional Responsibility. It was never submitted to Congress. It was never entered into the public record, but I have it. Patel sat very still. The report, Kennedy continued, details an aborted investigation into several contracts authorized under your leadership. It was initiated by a senior compliance officer after a series of irregularities were flagged. That officer was later reassigned. The inquiry was suspended, officially due to lack of scope. Unofficially, well, that's where things get murky. He let the last word hang. Murky. Patel adjusted his tie, then his cuff. His hand was steady, but his eyes weren't. I'm unfamiliar with that report, he said evenly. Kennedy nodded, as if he expected nothing less. Funny thing, he replied. The report includes a memo, unsigned, undated, but attributed to a senior executive who claimed that you personally requested the investigation be re-evaluated in light of political optics. Patel blinked. I'm not in the habit of commenting on unsigned documents. Kennedy reached back into his folder. Then maybe this will refresh your memory. He held up a second sheet, this one clipped with a sticky note bearing a timestamp and the Bureau's internal tracking code. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't have to. The silence did the reading for him. Across the chamber, a senator from Connecticut leaned forward, his brows narrowed. Another one from Arizona glanced sideways at Patel's aides, who had gone strangely still. Kennedy set the sheet down. You didn't just let the fire smolder, Mr. Patel, he said. You poured the water out before anyone could test the smoke. Patel opened his mouth, then hesitated, a beat too long. A hesitation just noticeable enough to catch in the air like a misplayed note in a quiet symphony. I was advised, he finally said, that the preliminary review lacked evidentiary foundation and posed an unnecessary distraction to ongoing operational priorities. Kennedy tilted his head. Advised by whom? Patel paused again, this time longer. I don't recall the specific advisor, he said carefully. A soft sound, a stifled exhale escaped from the back of the room. It might have been a laugh, or disbelief, or something in between. Kennedy leaned forward, his hands folded neatly. That's the problem, isn't it? These things never happen in full daylight. They unfold under the guise of normalcy, under the comfort of phrases like operational priorities and administrative discretion. But what you did, Mr. Patel, whether through silence or suggestion, was dismantle a system of accountability that was never meant to answer to you. Patel's jaw flexed. With respect, Senator, you are interpreting bureaucratic necessity as personal manipulation. That is a dangerous precedent. Not as dangerous, Kennedy replied, as letting the fox audit the henhouse. At that, one of Patel's allies, Senator Langley from Ohio, cleared his throat and interjected. Mr. Chairman, he said, I move that we take a 10-minute recess to review these new documents. It seems we're entering territory that hasn't been vetted by counsel. Kennedy didn't look at him. He kept his gaze locked on Patel. I'm not finished, he said simply. Langley started to respond but stopped. Something in Kennedy's tone cut off the air around him. This wasn't posturing, this was purpose. Kennedy turned back to Patel. Let's talk about the people who tried to raise the alarm, he said. There were 3 internal compliance officers who flagged irregularities tied to your office. 2 were reassigned within 90 days. 1 left the bureau entirely. You ever speak to any of them? Patel's voice was tight now. Personnel decisions are handled by HR. Sure, Kennedy said, but funny thing about one of those reassigned officers, he kept copies, memos, directives, email threads, and eventually he reached out to my office. That's how this started, Mr. Patel. Not because I had a grudge, not because I wanted a headline, because someone who believed in the Bureau more than they feared, it decided that silence was no longer an option. Patel's mouth twitched. It might have been anger or disbelief, or the beginning of the realization that the floor beneath him was shifting. Kennedy sat back in his chair, almost casual now. You built your defense on the assumption that no one would look too closely. That layers of red tape would hide the structure, that ambiguity would do your work for you, but ambiguity has limits, and we've reached them. The silence that followed was not like before. It was deeper, heavier, like something in the room had changed shape. For the first time, Kash Patel looked smaller, and John Kennedy, still calm, still southern, still soft-spoken, looked like the man holding the map to a place Patel never wanted the world to see. Kennedy didn't reach for more papers. He didn't glance at his notes. He just sat there, eyes steady, letting the stillness stretch until it felt unnatural. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than before, but colder. We've been talking about documents, Mr. Patel, about memos, directives, and the paper trails that danced just far enough outside the light to avoid scrutiny. He folded his hands and leaned forward slightly. But paper is patient. Paper can be rewritten. Paper can be lost. Another pause, a slow breath. Voices, though, those are harder to scrub. A rustle moved through the room like wind through dry grass. Patel's face didn't change, not yet. But his fingers gripped the table a little tighter. Kennedy reached into a separate compartment of his folder. From it, he drew a plain black USB drive. No label, no markings. Just a sliver of plastic and silicon that suddenly felt heavier than everything that had come before. This recording, Kennedy said, was provided by a former Bureau official who, until recently, worked under your chain of command. The individual has since entered federal whistleblower protection, but before they left, they had the presence of mind to preserve something. A staff meeting held on August 12th of last year. He set the drive down gently in front of him, almost reverently. It's not long, less than 4 minutes, but it contains something very clear, your voice, and an instruction issued verbally, off the record, to, quote, eliminate internal documentation related to the Niles Foundation inquiry. You remember that one, Mr. Patel? Patel didn't answer. You should, Kennedy said, because the Niles Foundation was flagged for potential campaign finance violations, and more importantly, for undisclosed financial relationships with federal contractors. One of their largest donors, incidentally, was also one of your largest external vendors. Millions of dollars flowed through both channels. And when the Bureau's Compliance Division opened a preliminary probe, you told your staff, again, quoting from the recording, we don't need that paperwork sitting around where the wrong eyes can find it. The room froze, no clicking pens, no coughs, no whispers, just silence. Patel's lips parted, but no words came, not yet. Kennedy didn't press play. He didn't need to. The weight of the words was doing the work on its own. I want to be clear, he said. This isn't speculation. This isn't interpretation. This is your voice, on a government recording, instructing subordinates to suppress investigative records that could implicate both your office and a political donor in a serious conflict of interest. Patel finally spoke. His voice was low, measured, but brittle at the edges. I want to speak to counsel. Kennedy nodded slowly. You'll get that chance. He looked around the room now, at the other senators, at the aides, at the audience that had gathered in the back rows. All of them were watching a man unravel. This recording, he continued, was authenticated by two independent forensic analysts. It contains no splices, no anomalies, and it lines up precisely with metadata from internal bureau scheduling logs. He turned his gaze back to Patel. You told your staff to erase the footprints, but you forgot that some of them still believe in where those footprints laid. Patel said nothing. Kennedy leaned back slightly, just enough to let the silence rush in and do what silence does best, clarify. Now I don't know what your next step is, Mr. Patel. That's up to you and your lawyers, but I know what mine is. He tapped the folder once. I'll be submitting this recording, along with all corroborating documentation, to the Senate Ethics Committee, the Inspector General's office, and the Department of Justice. The silence deepened, not like before. This one wasn't just heavy, it was final. Patel looked down, eyes unfocused. He wasn't defending anymore. He was retreating inward, calculating escape routes that no longer existed. One of his aides reached for his shoulder, but he brushed it off with a quick movement. Not now, not in front of them. Kennedy wasn't done. There's something dangerous about power when it no longer fears oversight, he said, his voice softening into something almost elegiac. It starts small, a budget line here, a vendor there, a phone call not logged, a document that goes missing, but then it grows. Because once you cross that line, the only way forward is deeper. He paused, just briefly, and then one day, a man wakes up and realizes he's no longer working for justice. He's working for protection, his own. Patel looked up then. For a moment, there was something in his eyes, not fear, not anger. Something closer to understanding, or maybe regret, but it was too late for either. Kennedy stood. I have no further questions. No one moved. The chairman cleared his throat, but even he seemed unsure how to proceed. The momentum of the hearing had cracked. What came next wasn't procedure, it was fallout. Patel sat motionless. He didn't reach for his notes, didn't shuffle his papers. He just stared at the table, at the USB drive sitting there like a verdict. Outside the chamber, the news vans were already lined up. Somewhere, an anchor was warming up with the words breaking story, but inside, the reckoning had already happened. And John Kennedy, without raising his voice, without pounding a desk, had done what few expected. He had made a man drown in his own silence. It wasn't a knockout punch. It was something colder. The realization that the ground had already given way, and the fall had begun long before anyone heard the first crack. The first headlines hit the wire services before the hearing even adjourned. Within an hour, they were everywhere. Washington Post, New York Times, Fox, MSNBC. Patel's name wasn't just trending, it was detonating. What had started as a procedural oversight hearing had exploded into a full-blown political scandal. Kennedy's quiet voice had somehow made more noise than a dozen shouting matches. By nightfall, the news anchors had already rehearsed the phrase key audio, recording at the center of the storm so many times it lost meaning. The USB drive was never shown on camera, but its presence haunted every chyron, every panel discussion, every late-night monologue. Inside Patel's camp, the walls cracked fast. A senior advisor resigned before the end of the day, citing personal reasons. Another staffer was photographed leaving the Hart building in a rush, phone pressed to his ear, the other hand dragging a half-zipped briefcase. Someone tried to ask him a question. He didn't stop. He just shook his head and muttered loud enough to be picked up by a nearby boom mic. They know everything, all of it. The next morning, the first joint letter arrived, signed by 6 civil liberties organizations, demanding a full criminal investigation into Patel's conduct. By noon, that number had grown to 18. The ACLU, the Brennan Center, government watchdogs, whistleblower protection groups, each calling the alleged erasure of federal investigative records a direct attack on democratic accountability. And yet, through all of it, John Kennedy didn't speak to the press. Reporters staked out his Senate office, his elevator stop, even his walk to the car. But he said the same thing every time, without inflection, without variation. I just did what was right. That was it. No speech, no victory lap, no television circuit. Just the words, said so plainly they cut through the noise like a scalpel. Behind the scenes, though, Washington was splitting at the seams. The GOP fractured almost overnight. Patel had long been considered a rising star among hardliners, a potential cabinet name in a future administration. But now, no one wanted to claim him. Some senators publicly distanced themselves. Others held their tongues, waiting to see where the tide turned. But the tide wasn't turning. It was rising. In backrooms and conference calls, Republican aides whispered about donor blowback, committee fallout, internal polling. This wasn't just a scandal, it was radioactive, and it didn't stop at politics. The Department of Justice issued a brief statement acknowledging it had received documentation related to potential misconduct and that it was reviewing the matter. No denials, no soft language, just a flat clinical confirmation that the wheel had begun to turn. Somewhere deep inside the bureau, old files were being reopened. Some emails were already under subpoena. Phones had gone quiet. Calendars had been cleared. The people who knew too much suddenly stopped answering calls. And still, Kennedy said nothing. He sat in committee hearings. He voted on routine legislation. He asked sharp but unremarkable questions in unrelated sessions. But no matter how many cameras pointed at him, he never returned to the scandal. Because he didn't need to. The story had a life of its own now. One night, 3 days after the hearing, a junior staffer, no older than 26, was caught on camera exiting the Eisenhower Executive Office building. He wore a loosened tie and a look of something between panic and exhaustion. A journalist followed him down the steps, calling out his name, asking what he knew. The staffer didn't turn around, but he said it anyway, loud enough to be heard by everyone watching the clip the next day. They knew the whole time. And they let it happen. That sentence played on loop for 48 hours. Cable news spun it into gold. Podcasts dissected every syllable. Op-eds bloomed like weeds. And in a town where everyone plays chess, Kennedy had played something else. A slower game, with fewer moves, but heavier pieces. He hadn't needed to yell. He hadn't needed to grandstand. All he had needed was the truth and patience. The fallout spread wider than anyone expected. Patel's upcoming book deal was frozen. A planned university lecture tour was quietly cancelled. One PAC scrubbed his name from its endorsements page. Another issued a statement calling for internal reforms. The same group had once hosted Patel as a keynote speaker, but in Louisiana, Kennedy returned to his state without fanfare. No press conference, no celebration. Just a town hall meeting in a church basement, plastic chairs, bad coffee. He was asked about Patel only once. He answered the same way he had in Washington, I just did what was right. Then he moved on, back to infrastructure, back to farm subsidies, back to the ordinary grind of government. But in every room he entered from that point on, there was a new weight to his presence. People didn't just hear him, they listened. Because they had seen what happened when he decided to speak. And they wouldn't forget. The auditorium was modest, nothing grand. Rows of folding chairs, a lectern stained from years of use, and a small podium light that flickered once before settling into a warm hum. The audience was made up mostly of law students, their notebooks open, laptops glowing faintly. A few professors sat in the back, arms crossed, listening not as faculty, but as citizens. John Kennedy stood at the front, no teleprompter, no media crew, no entourage. Just his usual slow cadence and a folded sheet of notes he never looked at. The kind of setting where his voice didn't echo, it just filled the space. He didn't mention Kash Patel, not once. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew why they were really there. Power, Kennedy began, isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it comes wrapped in paperwork that nobody wants to read. The room stayed quiet. That's why the law matters, he continued, because it gives shape to truth when the truth has no friends. And it gives people, ordinary people, a way to challenge the things that pretend to be too big to fail. A student in the front row nodded without realizing it. Another started typing. Kennedy walked slowly to one side of the stage, letting his words settle before picking them up again. I don't care how many degrees a person has, or how many titles they wear. If they forget who they serve, they stop being public servants and start being something else entirely. He paused, and that something else, he said, doesn't belong in government. Across the state, in a quiet room on the edge of a gated estate, a television flickered in the corner. The volume was low, but the picture was clear. Kash Patel sat alone, his chair too large for the desk he never used. The curtains were drawn, the phone face down. He wasn't taking calls. He hadn't taken any in days. On the screen, Kennedy kept speaking. The law is not a fortress. It's not a weapon. It's not even a shield. It's a promise. A promise that the powerful don't get to rewrite the rules just because they can afford to. Patel didn't blink. He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, where Kennedy's voice kept threading through the silence. When you're trusted with authority, Kennedy said, you don't get to hide behind bureaucracy. You don't get to confuse silence with loyalty. And you sure as hell don't get to erase what makes you uncomfortable. A thunderstorm rolled in outside Patel's window, distant thunder rumbling like a slow reminder that something was coming whether he acknowledged it or not. Back at the law school, Kennedy leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the sides of the podium. You're going to leave here and go into a world where some people will try to sell you a version of the law that fits their needs. They'll tell you that gray areas are convenient, that oversight is optional, that truth is negotiable. He let that sit a moment, then delivered it. It is. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a student closed their laptop, not out of boredom, but reverence. The Constitution, Kennedy said, wasn't written for perfect people. It was written to protect us from them, from the ones who think rules are for other folks, from the ones who confuse control with leadership. On the television, Patel sat motionless. Kennedy finished his talk the same way he had begun it, plainly. If you find yourself in power one day, ask yourself one thing. Am I using this to serve others, or am I using it to protect myself? If the answer's the second one, you've already failed. He nodded once, folded his notes, and stepped back. The room stood in quiet applause, not loud, not showy, just enough to say they'd heard something worth carrying forward. And in that moment, the story that had begun with a quiet southern drawl in a marble chamber didn't end with scandal or punishment or even justice. It ended with a mirror, held up not just to the man who fell, but to everyone watching.